Hey there, John McWhorter. How you doing?
Hi, Glenn. How are you?
I am doing fine. This is Glenn Loury at Stanford University. John, you have no idea how beautiful the view is looking out of my window right now.
You're not going to get me with that this time. It's a pretty day here in New York,
Oh,
too.
y'all don't have snow? I heard there was
No,
snowing.
that was a false alarm, and I'm actually in Jersey City in a tall building,
All
and
right.
I'm looking out on the harbor. So it's nice here today, too. Only today.
So I'm Glenn Loury, Stanford and Brown University and the Glenn Show, and with my conversation partner, my good friend John McWhorter. We have to stop meeting like this, John. It's like this is the only way that we have a relationship is talking on blogging heads.
Don't
Uh,
know when the last time with DC, right? Remember
yeah, I
that
think
DC
so.
thing? That was
I
it.
think so. Well, I'll get
Yeah,
back to the East Coast at the end of the academic year, and we'll have to see more of each other.
you're almost done.
Yeah,
You're almost done, aren't you?
I am sadly in the last 2 months of my sojourn here at this place, the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and it's been magnificent, I must say. But
Hmm.
all good things must come to an end.
Yeah.
Anyway, here with John McWhorter of Columbia University. And we're talking about affairs of the day for blogging heads. Our fans, John, have been calling for us to weigh in. I got a tweet from somebody saying,
Yeah. What did they?
please,
What was it they wanted?
they want us to talk about Trump, man.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
They're looking for, I don't know what, insight, comfort. They want somebody to tell them it's not as bad as it looks or something. I'm not sure what it is, but they want to hear from us. So I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you make of the Donald J. Trump phenomenon that's going on around us?
Well, the first thing that I think is the man a racist? I think in the definitions that we use, yes, he is, and I'm no fan of the man at all. But I do think that there's one oversimplified vision. I think that it's becoming very popular to say that what has set either him or certainly his followers off is that they don't like that the president's black. I don't see that. I don't think, and don't get me wrong. Yes, Trump says terrible things. I would, retch at him being president. I'm not supporting the man. But the idea that what has tipped, especially his followers off, is that there's a black man in the White House. That's a great movie. That it gets you going to think about it. I don't see it. And the reason I don't see it, I'm not saying they love that he's there, but I don't see that as a cause at all because what we're forgetting is that Twitter and Facebook both took off in 2008 and 2009. If you think about it, '08 was when Facebook became default, and '09 was when Twitter really took off. All this is documented. And I think that it looks today as if Obama tipped it off because it was then that social media got to the point that like-minded people could scream at each other all day long. And it also means that the people on the right who say that Obama is divisive because the race debate has gotten so acrid since he came into office, you listen to that and you think, Obama doesn't seem like a very divisive person. If anything, his fans think he's not divisive enough. It looks like he caused it because Facebook and Twitter became staffs of life exactly when he was inaugurated. So that's one thing that I find myself thinking.
Okay, let's talk about the one thing first, and then we can go on to other things. Post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. That's what I hear you saying.
Exactly.
Because it happened at the same time, we think it's caused by, but you think that's just a coincidence.
Hmm.
Obama's ascendancy and the social media revolution. So now I want to back up a little bit because you say he said these terrible things. So if Trump's a racist, you say,
Hmm.
but it's just not Obama's fault. Well, let me question that for the sake of argument, blogging heads, people. Okay, I'm not a Trumpista or whatever. For the sake of argument, what has Trump said that's racist? What has Trump done that's racist? Why why does everyone hold up these signs saying hate? Where's the hate? I'm asking you.
Oh, well, that's a very good question. And, the term racist is having a very interesting evolution. But
Indeed.
for example, he will say something like, we have a terrible president who happens to be African American. Never has the country been so divided. For some reason, when he said that 2 Saturdays ago, I think, there wasn't any big furore in the news. We have a terrible president who happens to be African American. Never has the country been more divided. That's a very rich statement. What does the black part have to do with it? We've never been more divided. Now, what does somebody being a terrible president have to do with we've never been more divided? So why bring the black into it at all? We have a terrible president, happens to be African American. We've never been more divided. Now, Trump's not articulate, and so you have to just imagine he has these three vague notions going through his head. And the three vague notions were terrible president, black, divided country. Now, that's a biased statement, especially considering what a pacific, non-divisive person Obama is. Now, it's not the Klan, but that was a really bar stool, gotta watch out for them, you know what's sort of statement. You know what I mean?
No, man, I don't. I mean,
Okay.
I see at worst a dog whistle in that. That is to say that he might have been trying to subliminally or indirectly communicate some kind of race signal by calling attention to the president's blackness in the context of assessing his performance. Because, of course, all the Republican candidates have been saying that Obama was a terrible president. I mean, Carly Fiorina thought he was a terrible president, and Marco Rubio thought he was a terrible president. Nobody's calling them racists. So it just feels like a little bit of a stretch to me, although if I were, and I am, African American and had to be on the lookout for potential political threats, a statement like that would cause my antenna to rear up.
I mean,
It still seems, hold on just a minute, I just want to say, some people are going to say it's racist because he's critically evaluating the president.
and that's flabby.
I mean, the president himself calls attention to his race on many occasions. Why is it that someone who criticizes him calling attention to his race necessarily racist? I mean, that statement strikes me, like I say, as pretty innocuous, except for the fact that he might be trying indirectly to signal to some people that to remind them, this guy's black. You don't like him. He's black. I know you don't like him because he's black. I don't like him because he's black. I don't want to say that, but whatever. But that's like second degree, third order racism, whatever. I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's a bit of a stretch. I mean, surely if we tried, we could find Joe Biden saying some stuff that is, comparably, questionable or whatever.
I mean, it's funny, Glenn, because you're catching me in something which I accuse other people of doing, and here I am doing it. I'm stretching to find something that people have read as racist. Some friends of mine, some white liberal friends of mine, think that statement in particular was just out and out racism, just because you hear certain words in sequence. And I would say that what Trump was trying to say was, here's a black president. He's divisive. Now, divisive certainly has something to do with race. He's saying that he's this black president who's obsessed with racism and stirring everything up. Now, that is not, in the strict sense, an anti-black sentiment. He's not there saying black people are inferior people. If anything, Trump was making a very divisive statement himself. I would say that sort of thing, where at best you could say it's a dog whistle, and even then maybe, is as far as it goes that I'm aware in terms of Trump. I've been rather impressed, actually, in terms of how racism fits into today's culture in this country, that of all the places that man goes, Mexicans are rapists, Megyn Kelly is menstruating, he never goes super far in terms of black people, except, remember the Ku Klux Klan? And so he was slow in disavowing David Duke. So there again, he's really going to the edge in all but saying, I don't care if somebody supports the Klan. But then he pulls away.
He did not seize the moment immediately to disavow David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan. He, being the media manipulator that he is, surely knew what he was doing when he didn't seize that moment. He could not have failed to understand that was a moment and that his decision was what it was. And so we're entitled to be able to read into that he's willing to try to cultivate appeal among certain quarters of the electorate by not denouncing David Duke. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't make him a racist, it at least makes him an opportunist willing to exploit other people's racism. Maybe that's a distinction without a difference. And so there would be the argument that he's a racist. also these things about Mexicans could be understood to be a kind of racist or ethnicist
Right.
kind of prejudice as well.
And we
Um,
should say he didn't say Mexicans are rapists. He talked about immigrants coming here. He was tarring a subset of Mexicans one might wish to specify, but still, it was a disgusting statement.
Here's the question I want to raise for myself as well as for you, which is, can we draw a clear distinction between a policy position adverse to the interest of a racial minority, which we might object to, that policy position on immigration or whatever, and a politician adopting a policy position that is adverse to the interest of a racial minority, and that politician being a racist?
Hmm.
Is that distinction not getting elided to a certain extent in our current practice? I mean, people holding up signs against Donald Trump wanting to build a wall, and then imputing to him this sentiment of animus and racism. It strikes me that maybe you're confusing there are a couple of things. Moreover, the, he hasn't really addressed himself, has he, as far as I know, to welfare policy, although he has been willing to suggest that his supporters are good people who love their country and that the
Right.
protesters are bums. I mean, he's kind of
Hmm.
implied that they're not very productive, they're losers, but he's come up to the line on that. He hasn't talked about affirmative action at all, as far as I know. I mean, I'm not
No.
sure. It's true, he was a birther. He went around cultivating the idea that the president wasn't legitimate, and I suppose one could impute that to the president's race, although let me just note that Donald Trump in the campaign hasn't been shy about attacking Ben Carson's religion, Ted Cruz's natality, Marco Rubio's stature, et cetera, et cetera. So, the difference between a racist and an asshole might be worth pointing out here, Anyway, the racist charge is such, as you have said so yourself quite eloquently, it's such a devastating thing if it sticks to somebody, right? I mean, that's like you said, I think once I thought it was well put. It's like calling somebody a child molester, or
It
something
is.
like that. I mean, it really is. They're beneath contempt and they have to be read out of polite conversation. And I don't know that having a strong anti-immigration, illegal immigration stance constitutes grounds for reading somebody out of the political conversation. And moreover, what I want to say is Donald Trump is in to some degree a front person for sentiments that are brewing amongst the population
Yeah.
of, we want our country back. Is that a racist idea? I mean, I can see a person would say, oh, want it back from whom? Want it back what? Clearly, it's about the demographic change that's going on. The whites are not in charge.
Right.
I've read it, ad nauseum, too many pieces in which that kind of argument has been made. But I'm not entirely persuaded by it. It might be one part of the picture, but the idea of a nostalgia for a time before and whatnot, it doesn't have to be racial. So maybe I'm bending over backwards not to see race here. I don't know. What do you think?
No, you're not. This plays into something that I've often thought about, which is that there are people for whom the race issue is just not at the top of their agenda. But they think about it. There are times when it would trump, so to speak, something else. But for them, there are other concerns that are more important than how black people or Latino would feel or whether it's good for them. So, for example, if you feel like you're a person of modest education and there aren't any jobs for you, then you might feel that that is more of a problem than race issues, such that you like that Trump is making these promises to fight for you. And okay, Trump says some things that aren't too cool about what you might phrase as the blacks, etc. But to you, that's simply you're not black, and that part just isn't as important as the part that he's directing towards you and a life that you are not enjoying at all. Now, there's a certain kind of person who thinks of that voter as a racist, because as far as they're concerned, they would give their vote to somebody who would pretend not to know what David Duke's positions are, etc. No, I don't call that a racist. What I call that is a matter of human beings of different sets having different priorities, and it's unrealistic of us to expect that all Americans are going to rate racism as the most important metric in how to judge another human being. And so there are an awful lot of us, I think, in the circles that you and I travel most in, it really is true. It's not an exaggeration. To be called a racist is pretty much equivalent to having it revealed that you have a history of molesting children. There's very little difference. I am not being hyperbolic. Everybody wants to avoid it. That's not true of everybody in America. And I don't think that it's fair to call this person who can't get a factory job anymore a racist because they thrill to Trump because he's got his fist in the air for them, and Trump isn't really terribly interested in racial sensitivities. So no, I agree with you there. We're taking the word racist and we're extending it in a way that really is designed more to reenact Arthur Miller's The Crucible than to make really useful distinctions. And, frankly, people who are not black have some real problems in terms of how the economy has changed. I can imagine myself being one of them. Now, I have a lot of friends who would immediately say, yeah, and they're all racists. But frankly, I think part of what they mean is what I'm saying here, that they don't think of race as a primary issue as they talk about their lives. I find it simplistic. So I would agree with you on that, basically.
Okay, well, let me up the ante a little bit here.
Is this one of those where we agree too much?
Yeah, this is the point where we have to disagree or we have to find something to talk about. I'm going to up the ante. So I didn't let's say I'm a white guy. I could be anywhere in the country, any class location. Rural, urban, well-educated, poorly ed. I'm looking at my TV, I'm reading the newspaper. And I didn't like what went down in Ferguson and Baltimore. I didn't like it. I saw riots. Okay, what I saw was an indulgent media.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
An indulgent media that kind of narrated the disorder and violence and arson and looting and unjustified rioting. It kind of narrated it as, not your mother's civil rights movement. Okay, this is what protest looks like today. Get used to it. I mean, they kind of legitimated it. They didn't go in there and report all the dirty, nasty stuff about how, and I'm making this up because I don't know if it's true, street gangs might have been implicated, or about, who was getting paid by whom to do what, or about witness intimidation in the aftermath of the Michael Brown event or whatever. You can find a little bit here, a little bit there, but you find very little about it. So I'm sitting there, I'm a white guy. They just shut down the interstate that runs through the middle of my town. There was some Black Lives Matter people out there with their self-righteous flag waving and whatnot, their banner waving and whatnot. I'm seeing thugs running around, including Michael Brown himself. What it looked like to me, he was a thug. He got what was coming to him. Again, I'm in the mind of this guy who's sitting there looking at this stuff. And then you say the president's not divisive. The president gets up and said, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon, even though the president did not know what happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman that night. And a jury decided that Zimmerman, et cetera, everybody knows what happened. The president sends Al Sharpton around as his emissary in other words, and then they'll call me a racist. You see what I'm saying? Because I object to that. Because when somebody has the courage to call that what it is, not that Donald Trump has addressed himself extensively to Baltimore, but if he did, I can imagine he'd be saying something like what I'm saying right now.
Probably.
I'm a racist. Well, you can take your racism and shove it to where, because you can't tell me that I can't be against a war on police. You can't tell me that I have to lay down when these people come down here and start looting and robbing and burning and everything like that. You say the cops are the problem? The last time I looked, they were shooting each other left, right, and center, and any white person who got in the way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here's my question, John. Doesn't a non-child molester type have a right to have that reaction to what's going on? I mean,
And let me put myself in the head of Mr. and Mrs. Upper West Side. All the people shooting each other are doing it because of racism in some way. And you racists just don't understand. I mean, what you're calling attention to, and let's face it, I don't know whether you want me to put it in these terms, but a lot of what you just said is just you, like a year ago, frankly. It doesn't have to be this white Joe Sixpack. And I think that what we're seeing is that after 2 years, it is sadly clear that as you reviled, there's a Michael Brown myth I mean, it's not unsafe to say this anymore. I don't think I'm going to get flamed like Jonathan Capar on Twitter. But the official story of Mike Brown is now official. You know, you can assume that there's going to be a movie made that is at best ambiguous. But basically, Mike Brown being shot down in cold blood for no reason is the story. And the actual facts are something that you're supposed to talk around. Even people who engage the actual facts, who are in a position to know, feel that it's somehow the wrong thing to do to actually call it as it was. It's the exact same thing as OJ 20 years ago. It took about 5 or 6 years before people were comfortable actually calling it the way it almost certainly was. And so, yes, this Joe Sixpack person you're talking about saw what the truth was, and it was not constrained to not admit the truth. And yeah, that guy's going to be mad. Now, is he a racist because he feels that that truth has been elided?
That's what I'm saying.
Frankly, no, he's not.
Exactly.
Now, he may be a racist for other reasons, but not that. No, I'm sorry. And I guess we're unpopular for putting it that way, or we're oversimplifying or something. But no, I agree with you again. Sorry.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, there's something here. I mean, there's this backlash. There could be this backlash against the political correctness. At least that's how I'm thinking about it now. That one of the things that Trump has understood in his outrageous flaunting of all of the rules of etiquette, things that, you're just not supposed to say. And I'm not defending it. I mean, questioning people's religion. I mean, it's personal insults. I mean, Megyn Kelly's biological processes. I mean, come on. This is outrageous. It's outrageous. I'll say it a third time. It's just outrageous. Okay. But I think one of the things that he's understood is that many people are chafing at the imposition upon them of a kind of discipline as to what it is that can and can't be said in public that they don't agree with, but they don't feel like there's any way that they can really object to it. And there's a kind of, the weak people, the minorities, the racial minorities are supposed to be powerless. We're supposed not to have any power. We're supposed to be victims. On the other hand, we actually do have a fair amount of cultural power, and in terms of being able to influence and to some degree determine what it is that can and cannot be said about ourselves. Okay, and there's nothing exceptional about that. I mean, there's some things that you can and can't say about Israel in American politics and expect to survive. And you might say that there are people out there who are chafing against that. And I don't know that they're anti-Semites because they resent the likely consequence of criticizing, I mean, I could name, McKinney, Cynthia McKinney, a congressman from Georgia who
I forgot about that.
Took certain positions, and people decided that they were going to try to keep her from getting reelected, and they succeeded in keeping her from getting reelected.
Again. That's right.
Et cetera, et cetera. And I have no dog in that fight per se, but I'm just saying it's not an unprecedented phenomenon that individuals might want to protect what they understand to be their group's interest by trying to discipline how it is that this goes on. And by the way, it's not only racial minorities who are doing this, and maybe even not mainly. It is, liberal elites and newspapers and televisions and so on, and in the academy and all of that. There's a consensus view, and it's just very hard to get a word in edgewise if you don't hold a consensus view. So to some degree, I think some of the support for Trump is fueled by people's admiration of the fact that he's prepared to take a stand. And that even if that stand flies in the face of the kind of the elite consensus about what one is supposed to say.
I mean, this is exactly true, and there's a real impasse because what a lot of these Trumpians are upset about, if it comes to race, why they like that Trump just says what he wants to say and kind of gives them a certain example, is that, for example, I mean, and this is something that some of them will even say, they see something like Black Lives Matter, and I'll say, as I've always said, I thoroughly support what they're doing in itself, but they see this furor against cop killings of young black men mostly. But then they also see what goes on within the neighborhoods, and they see that the same men are
Yeah.
more in danger of being killed by one another. And anybody who says that a better Black Lives Matter would also take that on too is shouted down as a moral reprobate. And I think a lot of whites and non-blacks are seeing that. And frankly, that's one of those emperor's new clothes things. It's so easy to look at that situation and think, what are those people most in danger of? Is it being shot by the guy down the street or some undertrained or even evil white cop? The answer is clear. But you're not supposed to say it. And nevertheless, and I'm going to just pick somebody at random, you talk about the media elite. If you ask Paul Krugman, and I'm not qualified to talk about his economic theory, if you ask Paul Krugman about this, what those people are upset about is that there's a nigger in the White House. As far as they're concerned, they don't like the fact that there are black people in charge and that Eric Holder was in there and now it's Loretta Lynch and that black people have more and more influence in the culture. These people just don't like this black thing. And that's all it could be. And the general tone is, if you don't agree with that, you're naive at best or you're a jackass at worst.
Yeah, yes. but that's a ridiculous position. I don't know if Paul Krugman would say it or not, but I could hear him saying it. And it's ridiculous.
He said it in one op-ed.
It's ridiculous. It's a little bit like saying the people who want to see the banks broken up are anti-Semites. That what they're mad about is that there's too many Jews on Wall Street. I mean, you don't know that. You know what I mean? The guy is a liberal Democrat. He kicked your butt, the Republicans, twice in national elections and then crowed about it. Okay? So you hate his guts. I mean, what's new? This is nothing new in politics, except now if you hate his guts, it's got to have a racial motive, because that's a high-handed way of preempting an actual examination of the evidence and, repairing to some supercilious kind of pomposity, in which you can pronounce on the morality of everybody who doesn't agree with you. I mean, so I'm not at all persuaded. I mean, I think the territory was going to be difficult ground for anybody who occupied it, just as George W. Bush or William Jefferson Clinton. And they can tell you, they tried to hang Clinton out there on Pennsylvania Avenue practically. It's tough going. Yeah, Obama is black. Yeah, for some people, that's a negative in their minds. There's not any doubt about that. But, that's the job he ran for. That's the job he won. That's the way it is. It's tough territory. I mean, so I'm not moved by that. I want to say one other thing, though. You were saying on this Black Lives Matter and the homicide amongst, African Americans and so on. And you say it's kind of like an empress has no clothes. And I agree. And I thought that when I went on YouTube and I watched the debate between Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans and Ta-Nehisi Coates out at the Ideas Festival at Aspen a year ago. And in that debate, Landrieu tries to raise this question. He brings these so-called books of the dead. He brings the actual books in which the unresolved homicide cases are written up for, and there's just like, many of them. There's hundreds of these cases. And almost all the victims are African Americans. And he confronts Ta-Nehisi. He says, see, I mean, this is part of the issue too. I'm with you about, white supremacy, but you got to take this on board. And Ta-Nehisi basically fronts him and says, what do you mean? This hasn't got anything to do with, this is all about white supremacy. He says basically what you said, someone would say, which is it's caused by the problems of racial exclusion, discrimination, and, contempt for African-American humanity, which has now manifested itself in this apparently self-destructive cycle, but it's really just further evidence of the extent to which. And my thought when I said it was, he's bluffing. It reminded me of when I used to play poker. Ta-Nehisi, he's bluffing. It's bluster. He's saying if I say it loud enough and angry enough, this guy's not going to have the nerve to challenge me. Because I thought, that's an empty argument. You can't be serious. I mean, if I took you seriously, everything that black people do would have to be attributed in one way or another, directly or indirectly, to white supremacy. You can't really mean that. I mean, struggle, the African-American struggle, the civil rights, everything, the arts, the creativity, everything would all be derivative. It would all, because there is no independent life here. We don't get to this, so you can't really mean it. You can't. And I guess, is Landry going to call? Or is he going to fold? Is he going to call? He folded. He folded, man. He did not call that guy's bet. And I still kind of feel that way about some of these things. So for example, mass incarceration. And I'm on the record, everybody out there in blogging heads, well before anybody ever heard of Michelle Alexander, I was inveighing against the evils of mass incarceration, but I just want to ask one question. How do I know that crowing and complaining and hysterically demonstrating about the evil of blacks' overrepresentation amongst mass incarceration is an indictment of the system and not an indictment of the blacks who are incarcerated? How do I know? What makes me so sure that counting the heads of the people in jail and finding out that blacks are way, way, way overrepresented automatically redounds to the conclusion that the system is racist? It could be that the black people disproportionately are criminal. That's another possible conclusion that you can draw from that. The person who runs around with a banner saying abolish prisons, they're like slavery, is bluffing in the sense in which I am using that term. They're counting on not being met with the counter argument that, no, actually, we could quibble about whether this law or that should be enforced this way or that. You don't like the war on drugs. I don't like it either. But I'll tell you what, when I look at who gets killed by whom in this country, when I look at who gets robbed and who does the robbing, when I look carefully at the crime statistics, what I see is blacks are 10% of the population, half of the offenders, roughly. That's what I see. 3, 4, 5 times overrepresentation amongst these people engaging in these negative acts. That's what I see. So maybe we should change the drug laws. Maybe we shouldn't. But the disproportionate presence of African Americans is largely a consequence of their own behavior. That is another argument. I'm not endorsing that argument. I actually think the situation is more complicated than that in ways that would be more sympathetic to progressive criticism of the incarceration regime. But the common everyday person, the high school graduate working at a factory and coming home with a lunch bucket and trying to live on $30,000 a year, that argument is going to sound like common sense to them. And a lot of people, I think, are bluffing. They are posturing on the anticipation that their outrage will preempt a person starting to go down that path.
I disagreed finally today with you.
Oh, good.
And it's about the psychology.
Yeah.
They're not bluffing at all, and that's why this is so hard. I mean, just start with the fact that I haven't seen this YouTube clip, but I'm sure that Ta-Nehisi Coates got a lot of applause for what he said. And I'll bet that it was on the word white supremacy, because that term has a certain potency. It kind of smells like chocolate. All you have to do is say it, and everybody jumps out of their seat. And so, but more to the point, it's not a bluff. And here we go with this one person again, but Ta-Nehisi Coates is not kidding. He's not bluffing. He's not thinking, I know that Landrew isn't going to speak the truth, and so I can say this and become famous. That's what Ta-Nehisi really thinks. And it's because, and I'm sorry, folks, that I'm going to come off as quote unquote kinda arrogant, etc. Here comes some arrogance. It is because he is under the spell of this religion that I talked about. Religion is a kind of thinking. It is an entire worldview. Somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates isn't thinking, I know that the black on black killings, and notice you're not even supposed to use that term now, but black on black killings, I know that that cannot be ascribed to racism in any real way, but I'm going to stand up here in front and say it. As far as he's concerned, what seems kind of abstract to us, this idea that they're killing each other because their fathers couldn't get factory jobs, et cetera, et cetera. All of that makes as much sense to him as it does to you and me that rain is going to hit the ground. It's all been worked out. It's what people are taught in college. You get it from reading You're the Nation and the Mother Jones and everything else. They really believe that. Just like you and I really believe what we believe. This is tough stuff because it's impervious to fact. But it's not that the person in question is thinking of it that way. Well, anti-racism is a religious creed. Okay. Sorry for the arrogance.
No, John.
I believe that.
And you've established that hypothesis in previous discussions here and in your writing about religion, about the new religion of anti-racism. So I think that's going to go down in the books as a contribution to this deliberation, this national conversation on race that we're having from one John McWhorter. But I wanted to ask a question. You say not bluffing. Okay, maybe not. Relying on both believing what they say and relying on an understanding that there's a plurality of liberal opinion out there that will back it up. But why then the obsession with verbal etiquette? Why then the effort to excise the use of the word thug, for example, or the use of the word black on black crime or black crime? Why the obsession with this kind of etiquette? It's like policing the language is a defense against the possibility that an otherwise not easily refuted line of thought might enter into the conversation. We try to preempt it at the outset. No, you say that's wrong?
It's not that conscious. It is not permeable to that extent by logical reasoning. It's a very special realm of thought. My impression, and no, I haven't done any tests, but my impression from the passion and the brilliance of people who make that kind of argument is that they genuinely are offended, because this way of thinking means that anything that rubs me the wrong way in a way that has to do with my color is wrong, because it's connectable to this thing called racism. If it hurts me and I am racial, then it must be racism. No, they mean it. And so you're not supposed to say black on black crime, because frankly, first of all, the idea of black people doing that to each other is just viscerally offensive, and therefore there must be something even larger about the offense because I am of a race and I'm offended. And then also, you really are supposed to realize it's the catechism. It's what you went to Sunday school for. You're supposed to understand that the reason that this guy kills the other guy is because he doesn't have a job, because he didn't have a father who taught him to go to work, and the father was like that because he couldn't get a factory job, and he couldn't get a factory job because of deindustrialization, and also the cops don't like him, and he learned early on that society that's really the way you're supposed to think.
That's a cartoon. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to say that is a cartoon version of the reality that doesn't actually show respect to the people who are living it on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that is perhaps an accurate description of the way people think, but I can't believe that well-educated and sophisticated people would be content with such a trivial reduction of the humanity of the people that we're talking about down to being chips on a board pushed this way and that by the business cycle. I mean, really?
Yeah. It feels good to be the underdog in some ways, especially if genuine circumstances are such that a great many people who you're representing are not suffering from desperate circumstances. Remember that you're the person who always has a certain wisdom. You're somebody who always understands a certain higher reality, and you're a noble victim. That feels great. I think all of us in some areas of our lives play that role. I certainly do. In school, it's the tattletale, the person who's always telling on people and is valuable to the teacher. All of that can be magnified into a whole kind of social identity. That, and not Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, was what my book Losing the Race was about, and I explored it more in Winning the Race. That's why people settle for it. Now, the fact that it also means that black Americans are the most passive and powerless people in the history of the human race, that's not something that I think most people are terribly interested in thinking about.
Well, they should be.
I
apologize. They should be interested, John, because you know where we're headed here in the 21st century? We're headed to a world in which people like you and me and another, big chunk of African Americans are doing very well, but where a huge number, 35, 40%, are going to be just kind of written out of the American prosperity and the American promise. I mean, and that being written out is going to be very, very difficult to reverse. And it's just going to feed the intellectual bankruptcy that in my opinion, that you're describing, because people will then say, you see. I mean, they'll be able to point to the failure and attribute it to implacable, impermeable, inevitable anti-black sentiment in the country. America was built on slavery, built on the foundation of racism and so forth. And nothing's going to happen.
Do you think so? Because the way I'm thinking lately is that what can happen is that with intelligent social policy, slowly, it's not going to happen on any one great day, but over a generation, enough change could happen that Black America could be talked about in a brand new way. The more observant journalists would pick up on it first, and then gradually there would be a trickle of scholarship about it. And in the meantime, it will have been talked about in a way that is increasingly removed from the reality. And as I've said before, to an extent, you have to allow that talk as a kind of liturgy, as a kind of song. And, we often talk about the op-eds of Charles Blow, and just let it go and just assume that the way it's written about and talked about is going to operate at a radical disconnect from what the reality is. I think things could get better, despite the fact that there would always be a certain crowd on the sidelines pointing out what was worst and making dire predictions and insisting that all of it was because white people don't like black people and the system is set against us. I think that could happen.
I hope you're right, man. But I tell you, here we are. We're 50 years after 1966, 50. And it looks like, I'm not going to say nothing has changed. A lot has changed, but I don't see what used to be called the black underclass and what still exists. I got a call from, I don't see that going away anytime soon, and I don't see that the policy direction suggests that we're going to reverse it. I was going to just say briefly, I got a call from my former student, my friend and colleague, Roland Fryer, the economist at Harvard. And Roland had been in New York City. And
didn't he just get a medal?
He just won the Clark Medal,
Bates?
John Bates Clark Medal in economics, which is the most prestigious prize in economics short of the Nobel Prize. It's given every year to a young economist under the age of 40. Mm-hmm. So it's like a junior Nobel who has done outstanding work. Only one person can win it in a year. Mm-hmm. So not that many people are going to win it, and, I'm very proud of Roland. But what I wanted to say was that who's the Harlem Children's Zone guy in New York City?
You just chased him out of my mind. Jeffrey Canada.
Yeah, Jeff Canada had arranged for Roland to go down and meet maybe with 20 people, just people from Harlem that Canada interacts with in his charter schools and his various
I've been wondering how that was doing, the HCZ, yeah.
Yeah, so it's doing. I mean, in the charter school, apparently, Roland has done a careful evaluation of it, has been very strong, and some of the other programs. Anyway, Roland just said he just sat in a room, for a day. Talking with people and listening to the stories that they had to tell about their lives. And he was just profoundly shaken by it, so much so that he Skyped me up. He called me up. He said, I just want to talk to somebody, because he was feeling so despondent and depressed and also so energized that something had to be done. So this is about domestic violence, sexual abuse, child neglect, paternal abandonment. He's saying... I've been working on schools. This is Roland. Roland's been working on schools, trying to figure out what you can do to make schools better and more effective for low-income minority kids. He's saying, sometimes I came out of that conversation kind of feeling like I might be wasting my time, because how are you going to, you may be able to make the school a little bit better, but if the kid is coming in there, it's an 8-year-old having to fight off the stepfather from trying to come into her bedroom, how's she going to pay attention to the class? Or another kid, he said 3/4 of the young men that he spoke to had seen firsthand somebody that they cared about murdered, had observed it, had seen it. Now, this is not a random sample, not meant to be representative. This is just the people that he was talking to. But he's saying with that kind of trauma, so he's starting to think you're going to need massive counseling and intervention. You're going to need nurse home partnerships. So he says... my late wife, Linda, was a wonderful mother, and Roland always admired her for how wonderful a mother she was. When Roland was a graduate student, our kids were small. They're in their 20s now, but Linda we'd go driving up to our summer house in New Hampshire. Roland would come along for the ride, and he'd listen to Linda playing word games and math puzzles with the kids, priming them cognitively, developing their vocabulary, always pushing them, books. She's constantly reading to them. I read to them once or twice myself. So he's saying, how are these girls going to know how to be the kind of mother that Linda was? They just don't have a prayer. They don't have a clue about how to do it. No one has ever showed them or taught them. They don't have the equipment. Their lives are so chaotic. They're under so much stress. He just was feeling like it was kind of hopeless. And I'm just afraid. What I'm afraid of is that the policy response can't possibly be vigorous and extensive enough if we don't get clear about what needs to be done, okay? White supremacy is not a policy. It doesn't say anything about what to do. It's a blame game, okay? And confronting the reality in the lives of these people who are disadvantaged and who may be black and they may not be because they're white people in the same position requires at first, in the first place, acknowledging the facts of their lives rather than trying to paper them over. So, and I'll give one final example. I'll stop. And Roland agreed with this. I said, the school to prison pipeline metaphor, okay? Kids in schools where the police are there to present order and kid might be suspended. And then the same kid ends up 5 years later in prison. And people talk about the school to prison pipeline. And Logan, and I don't want to attribute this to Roland, you might say, and I'm saying it right here, that that's a slogan in search of a causal model that connects to things. It's a slogan. It invites us to think, you see, the system is just simply criminalizing these black kids. When in fact, it could well be a manifestation of the idea that the kid who doesn't get the right kind of socialization in his home both acts out in class and ends up being disruptive and suspended, and ends up involved in criminal activity when he's in his late teens and early 20s. The same failure of development. I'm talking about psychological development. I'm talking about the acculturation to be able to control your emotion, the ability to be able to sit still for a period of time and hear what somebody else is saying to you, how to deal with your anger, things of this kind. The same deficiencies of psychological maturation manifesting themselves in the kid in the classroom and in the thing. Now, I'm not saying this is true. I don't know. This is an empirical question. It could be true. To the extent that it is the case, that is, the problems of behavior of students of color in schools are at least in part a result of the inadequacy of their socialization in their homes, not simply of the racist treatment of the school system. To the extent that that is true, writing off these disproportionality and suspension rates as yet another manifestation of, school to prison pipeline racism directs our attention away from what has to be done to actually solve the problem, which is intervene with these kids, perhaps intervene with them early and vigorously to, universal pre-K could be the thing. I don't know. We'd have to get down to cases. We'd have to get down to, but at least we'd be talking about what needs to be done. And I'll stop. Comparably, I'm concerned about the underrepresentation of students of color in the STEM disciplines in the elite colleges. And I feel like, we're not addressing the fact that they don't know calculus and they don't know algebra well enough to be able to manage in those courses, which require you to really have that kind of technical mastery. And there could be plenty of reasons why they don't. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay for them to not know calculus. That wouldn't be my view. I wouldn't think so. But if you don't acknowledge the fact of it, you're never going to do anything about it.
What you just said and what Roland saw is something that has been seen now regularly. Frankly, since the early 60s, if you look at the ethnographies, or in terms of something that we recognize as very much our today, that hasn't changed for 45 years. And what really scares me is that the Harlem Children's Zone is something that first came to my attention, and this is before I dedicated myself to these things as much, in the year 2000. I think that's when the media really jumped on the Harlem Children's Zone. There was a beautiful New York Times magazine cover with Jeffrey Canada marching down the street with people from the inner city behind him, and it sounded like it was going to do wonderful things. And, I have looked after it on a yearly basis. I've wanted to know how it was going to do. And if I'm not mistaken, it's doing very well in terms of a charter school, maybe two. But the idea that it was going to blanket the neighborhood, one city block after another, and change circumstances. I feel like in the 16 years that I've been aware, and that's a generation. When I first became aware of the Harlem Children's Zone, a whole generation of kids weren't born yet.
Yeah.
If that's what Roland is seeing in the schools, I'm beginning to wonder whether that approach is bearing fruit. And I'm not pointing fingers or saying that somebody didn't do their job, but it shows that it would appear that blanketing city blocks with this love and care, and even the research of some sociologists, isn't doing anything. And God bless the charter school. But what I hear about HCZ these days is that it's got a great school. That's not what the buzz was supposed to be back in the day. And so it means that we need a novel approach. And I think for many people, talking about white supremacy is the novel approach. It seems like you're looking at it from a bird's eye view and looking at what the real problem is. But unfortunately, as you say, white supremacy is too abstract. You can't fix white supremacy, at least not within several lifetimes. And so I think that there need to be better, I think that there need to be more effective and perhaps more innovative solutions, which is why I'm always thinking about the war on drugs. I feel like that would change the whole employment picture in neighborhoods like that. That's just my little idea. But what you're talking about is depressing, and even more depressing is Roland Fryer, of all people, Skyping you from one of those classrooms in 2016 and having that to say. That's not what we were hoping would happen back in 1999 and 2000.
Listen, John, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's just that. And so I think we need new solutions. Certainly the way it's being talked about now by many of our best and brightest seems to have little hope of fixing problems like these. And that's where we are.
I was going to say, I agree with you about the war on drugs. We should get out, but I don't agree with you that would solve the employment problem because, these kids need skills. I mean, this is something I've learned from Robert Cherry, the economist at Brooklyn College there in City University, New York, who's constantly talking about the low-end labor market. And I want to raise another point about the low-end labor market. And his main point is, kids got criminal records and stuff like that. But you know what? These kids, many of them can't read either.
Yeah.
And you're 18 years old and you can't read or you can't barely read and whatnot. That's a real problem. So there's developmental issues there, of people not having their human potential fully realized because our various institutions, whether they be in the private sector, the family and such, or they be those public schools and whatnot, have failed these kids. But the low-end labor market, we were talking about Donald Trump earlier. I am predicting here, John, and anybody else who can hear me, that Donald Trump, if he becomes the Republican nominee, is going to vigorously campaign for the black vote. And he's going to get more of it than the pundits would now allow. I'm not going to say how much, but more than they would think, because they think it's 0 or 7%. I think it's going to be more than that. And here's why. Because he's going to take the line, consistent with his immigration stance, that letting in a sort of uncontrolled flow of low-skilled workers from Mexico is destroying the labor market for the unskilled blacks. They're competing head-to-head in Los Angeles and Houston and New York and et cetera,
You mean for jobs picking fruit and mowing lawns?
No, I don't mean that. Although those are some of the jobs. But some of the jobs are working in hotels, working in restaurants, working in light manufacturing, and so forth and so on. And indeed, the economist George Borjas at the Kennedy School at Harvard has a book that's going to be coming out later this year on immigration. He's perhaps the leading immigration economist in the country. He's a guy in his 60s, a Cuban immigrant originally as a child, who spent a career doing quantitative research on immigration. And in his book, he has an example of a chicken processing plant in North Carolina, I believe it is, that had been employing Mexican-American workers illegally, got busted by the feds. They did a visitation and they caught them out, so they had to stop doing it. And went on to replace their workforce with African Americans. And so the point is, and they were advertising and, they hired a lot of African Americans into the plant. But the African Americans, being Americans, knowing their rights and having a higher expectation than $6 an hour and no benefits, started organizing and complaining and agitating for a higher thing. So the company then ends up basically replacing them with immigrant workers, again, this time legal immigrant workers, but cheaper and easier to deal with. And the blacks are out again. So this is just one little plant, okay? This is just an anecdote. It's not meant.
Yeah.
But Roger Waldinger, the sociologist at UCLA, has a book out there called How the Other Half Works. Yeah. And it's all about how work is organized for the low-skilled workers in the greater Los Angeles labor market. He studies the furniture industry, the hospitality industry, hospitals, and so on and so forth. And amongst many things, it's a complicated story. But one of the subtexts there is once a kind of critical mass of foreign-born workers get into a company or an industry, the natural orientation is for employers to use the networks amongst the employees' social connections to recruit additional workers. Moreover, you've got a language thing going on. The blacks don't speak Spanish. So if I've got 70% of my line workers who are native Spanish speakers, most of whom don't speak English, it's kind of like, at the margin, the natural thing to do is to hire somebody else who's speaking Spanish. Right. So that kind of these affluences, it's just hard to believe that there's not something there. The question is how, something in terms of competition. The question is how much. Now, a lid has been kept on this. This is what I'm talking about. Emperor has no clothes. It's been politically suicidal for an African-American Democrat to stand up and say, he might as well be pro-life. To say immigration hurts my people, he might as well be pro-life. I mean, he just is killing himself in terms of a national career, or herself. So, and maybe they don't think it, I don't know. But as a social scientist, it's just very hard for me to avoid seeing that as a nexus of conflicting interests. The only question is, how big are the effects, not whether or not they're there. Right. And I think Trump's going to tap into that.
Glenn, to tell you the truth, we have hit a mundane point where I have to get one of my daughters from school. I'm going to do something I have not done in almost a decade of blogging heads, which is because I took my contacts out, I'm going to put on my glasses. And I'm going to say this one thing.
Okay, John.
I disagree with you about that. Sounds like something from an economics textbook. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But I think religion is going to get in the way. Black America is going to be taught that Trump is a racist and that therefore he doesn't deserve any of our allegiance because of various things that he has said. And that will trump, so to speak, any more mundane concerns about whether or not Trump is in favor of black employment. That is my guess. Let's see.
Okay, we'll see. John, I must say, I envy you, your beautiful daughters. I see the photos on Facebook. Blogging Heads Land, these kids are unbelievable beautiful. They're just stupefyingly beautiful. So congratulations, Father John McWhorter.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm going to go get one of my little beauties.
You have a good afternoon.
Let's continue this much sooner than we usually do.
Yeah, we will. Because we didn't talk about the black scent problem.
We have to get to that. That's right.
Take care, friend.